This video was originally uploaded on Patreon. If you like what I do, join me over there so the success of this channel isn't dependent on the whims of the YouTube algorithm. Star Trek began life looking like this, but later evolved into looking like this. So what happened here? Aside from the obvious increase in budget and more advanced production techniques, why does the former feel like a TV show firmly rooted in the 60s, while the latter feels like it belongs on the big screen? For lack of a better term, what makes this Star Trek cinematic? For the longest time, Star Trek existed as a low-budget TV show. Next to sci-fi blockbusters like Star Wars, Star Trek always seemed cheaper and, dare we say, a little bit lame. Even Star Trek's big-screen outings were budget-conscious productions. Paramount Pictures was so averse to spending money on Star Trek movies that Jonathan Frakes and LeVar Burton had to share uniforms with the DS9 cast in Generations. But all of that changed in 2009. Director JJ Abrams completely overhauled Star Trek's visual style for his reboot of the mythos. Whereas older Star Trek could be likened to a stage play, Abrams' take on the material was packed with energy, expressed through dynamic camera moves, intense Dutch angle close-ups, and of course the lens flares. Now that Star Trek had some money behind it, Abrams seemed intent on putting that money on screen. In other words, he strived to make Star Trek more cinematic looking than ever before. Though Abrams is no longer involved in the Star Trek mythos, it seems modern Star Trek in general took his style to heart. Now Star Trek TV shows are made to look like blockbuster events, works fit for the big screen. But in being so determined to make Star Trek look cinematic, has Star Trek missed the forest for the trees somehow? And what does cinematic even mean anyway? To answer these questions, let's compare the visual style of 90s Trek and modern Trek. To this end, I've chosen an episode at random from TNG and Discovery. The episode Evolution from TNG Season 3 opens with this beautiful shot of the Enterprise flying past a star. It's full of rich colours, and the movement of the camera at the Enterprise gently guides the viewer's eye. We immediately notice the star on the right, then we follow the ship as it crosses the frame, and finally our focus is drawn to the second star in the system. Not only is this opening shot extremely pleasing to the eye, but also establishes the geography of the star system and sets up the reason why the Enterprise is here in the first place. For the most part, the Next Generation is directed in a very traditional manner. There is no, and I mean no, unmotivated camera movement. The camera is always tracking, panning, or tilting to follow the action. It's nice, clean, and efficient. For the most part, the scenes in TNG are made up of coverage, a wide shot which can move to follow the action, a close-up on each character with an extra closer close-up to emphasize certain lines, and some medium shots sprinkled in when required. Many of these shots are long by today's standards. Sometimes an entire scene unfolds in only 2 or even 1 camera setup. While this is a visual style which is effective at communicating information to the viewer, it's too objective for its own good. The writing and acting are what carry the drama for the most part, not the visuals. This sometimes results in TNG feeling stilted, slow, and even stagey. The blanket lighting doesn't help matters either. It's a subtle effect, but it makes the show look like it's taking place in studio sets rather than on a real spaceship. This is something DS9 and Voyager improved upon later, as well as the TNG movies. Just look at the difference some extra consoles and more dramatic lighting made to this same bridge set in Star Trek Generations and even Star Trek Picard. All of this is to say TNG's visual style is not emotionally driven. The viewer sits back and watches from a distance rather than the story being told visually to make the viewer feel part of the drama. This brings me to my least favourite type of scene in all of 90s Trek, the briefing room scene. I don't know about you, but I always disliked the briefing room sets and how they were shot. The actors enter the room, sit down, talk in close-ups, watch a PowerPoint presentation from Geordi or Data, and then they're dismissed. In Star Trek 09, JJ Abrams took what would have been another bland briefing room scene and moved it to the bridge. Not only is the bridge more visually interesting, but it allows for opportunities for visual storytelling through blocking. I love the opening shot of this scene, how it effortlessly guides the viewer's eye from one character to the next. I love how Spock, despite being at a lower point in the room, is given all the authority through this low angle and stage-like backdrop of the view screen. And at the end of the scene, the curved lines of the ceiling converge on Spock for his final shutdown of Kirk.
Get him off this ship.
The bridge is just a great set to use for these kinds of scenes. The briefing room is basically designed like a boardroom, and not really as interesting to look at, and rarely is the blocking very creative. Enterprise almost understood this, hence why the briefing scenes happen either in Archer's ready room or at this little meeting area at the back of the bridge. For another comparison, this briefing scene in Star Trek Discovery is too high energy. It starts well with a pullback through a hologram and pan over to Pike, but then it goes haywire with this spinning camera around all three characters, which is a nice segue to talking about Discovery in general. The sound of thunder from Discovery's second season kicks things off well in its pre-credits teaser with a series of long take scenes which are all joined together by seamless wipes, pans, and match cuts. The camera moves effortlessly from subject to subject, framing dialogue in these nice two-shots. Each one of these shots is not only aesthetically pleasing thanks to the wide range of colours and nicely shaped lighting, but the camera movement is also more energetic than in TNG while still being motivated. However, there is a tendency for the camera to move for no reason. During this exchange between Saru and Culber, the camera is constantly moving to the left, then to the right, left again, and back to the right. The camera has to follow Saru over to this screen later in the shot anyway, so this is just movement for the sake of movement. One could argue it adds visual interest, but the sets, costumes, and lighting already provide that visual interest. The extra camera movement isn't necessary. After the credits, we come to another issue with modern Trek's visual style, but in truth this isn't a problem unique to Star Trek. It's a trend which is all over modern film and TV, and if you're a filmmaker this may come across as a hot take, but I really dislike shallow focus. Or rather, I think shallow focus is being overused to an absurd degree. If you don't know what shallow focus is, it's when the subject is in focus and everything behind them is soft. The shallower the focus, the narrower the amount of space in front of the lens, which is sharp. There's nothing wrong with shallow focus as a tool, but at some point, I guess, somebody decided that shallow focus was just inherently cinematic, and so should be used for absolutely everything. Close-ups, wides, it's all shallow focus. These kinds of shots did exist in 90s Trek, of course. You can end up with this effect even when shooting on a wide lens. However, these days, long lenses seem to have become more and more popular. It's not uncommon for productions to use 70mm or 85mm lenses as their go-to lens. The problem with shallow focus is that it limits the amount of visual information a shot can contain. Again, shallow focus can be useful if the goal of the shot is to isolate the subject, but using shallow focus in so many shots means everyone is isolated. This is a story about a crew working together on a spaceship, and yet the crew are isolated from each other and isolated from their ship in the majority of the shots. The relationship between people and the places they inhabit is an important one, and yet in so many movies and shows these days that relationship is not visually communicated. Foundation is literally about large-scale societal changes. It's about big groups of people and powerful institutions, and yet it rarely conveys this idea visually. Then again, that show kind of abandoned the original point of its story in the first place. Ted Lasso is about the main character's relationship to this football team, yet he too is often isolated from the team and the pitch because the show is also shot in incredibly shallow focus. Honestly, I don't see the point in shooting in 4, 6, or 8K if all those extra pixels are only used to render blurs. What's the point in building lavish sets or travelling to exotic locations if we see them blurred out most of the time? You might as well shoot everything on a green screen. Star Trek Discovery has some fantastic sets and locations, yet we often don't get to see them properly. This scene on Discovery's bridge is 3 minutes and 35 seconds long. It contains 75 shots for an average shot length of 2.68 seconds. Of those 75 shots, every single one has a moving camera. 35 of those shots are close-ups, and only 12 aren't in shallow focus. The issue is intensity. During this scene, Saru gets emotional and squares up to Captain Pike, something which surprises the rest of the crew, prompting Burnham to talk him down. This is the perfect moment to ratchet up the intensity, but the scene is intense from the start. Even when Detmer is just relaying sensor information, it's shot like an action sequence with this swirling background, tilted framing, and sweeping camera move. When everything is intense, nothing is intense. While 90s Trek often felt stilted and lacked excitement, modern Trek can sometimes have too much excitement. It gets visually tiring to keep up with, making it difficult to connect with emotionally. It's no surprise then that Discovery's most emotional beats can sometimes feel over the top. Perhaps there's a feeling that the performances and the music need to be so big because the show is so visually intense overall. The widescreen aspect ratio also clashes harshly with the over-reliance on close-ups. At times, the forehead and chin of several actors are cut off. This episode in particular has these bizarre profile close-ups which not only cut off the top and bottom of the head, but also leaves loads of dead space in front of the actors. There's a similar framing problem in scenes between Burnham and Saru. Saru is much taller than Burnham, and so Burnham is sometimes awkwardly placed at the bottom of the frame to the point of almost being cut off. If the show was in a taller aspect ratio, these framing problems could be avoided, but because black bars are cinematic, modern Trek is forced into an aspect ratio which some directors clearly aren't comfortable with. It's worth mentioning though, the cause of these problems likely has nothing to do with the talents of the people involved. Instead, it's more likely the result of tight scheduling and studio edicts. In this interview with Jonathan Frakes, he compares what it's like directing episodes of Star Trek to directing episodes of the Orville. His answers essentially confirm that the cinematic visual style of modern Trek and the retro style of the Orville were essentially decreed by the producers and not the directors. However, both shows have to be shot on the same kind of demanding schedules common in TV production. Therefore, the constantly moving camera and the over-intense coverage are quick ways of achieving a look which at first glance is cinematic, but not in a way that serves any purpose. I don't want to sound overly negative here. I know some of my criticisms are nitpicky filmmaker things most casual viewers never even noticed. Modern Star Trek can look amazing. The Sound of Thunder itself is full of wonderful shots and sequences. When the show pulls the camera back, lets shots last longer and shoots in deeper focus, the results are stunning. This emphasis on making modern Star Trek look as cinematic as possible has on many occasions hurt the presentation of the show rather than helped it. Although modern TV in general has made some big leaps in terms of production value, even big budget peak TV should not be treated like it's a movie. A modern sci-fi show which understood this was The Expanse. By some estimates, this was a show which had less than half of Discovery's budget, and yet it still had extremely high production values and cinematic direction. The show still has some economical TV schedule necessitated coverage, but that just means the filmmakers had the time to pull out all the stops for the big moments when they needed to. The excellent set design is showcased to its maximum in wonderfully composed wide and medium shots. Shallow focus is used appropriately when the emotion of the scene calls for it, and then there's the aspect ratio, or ratios as I should say. By the last two seasons, The Expanse developed this terrific visual language whereby planet-based scenes were filmed in widescreen with anamorphic lenses, and space-based scenes were shot in full frame with spherical lenses. Even moons got their own aspect ratio. But I suppose that brings us to the ultimate question. What does cinematic actually mean? Well, it has nothing to do with specific focal depths, frame sizes, or camera moves. These are just tools. Cinematic filmmaking is the kind of filmmaking which uses every facet of the filmmaking language to tell its story. The reason TV production had to rely so much on standard coverage was because its tight schedules didn't allow for much else. Movies, on the other hand, had the time and money to think about every shot. The Next Generation unfortunately looked flat and boring a lot of the time because the cast and crew had to produce 25-hour-long episodes every single year. But Star Trek's visual style was already evolving throughout the 90s. Deep Space Nine and Voyager don't look remotely as flat. Cinematic is a quality achieved by taking advantage of every aspect of filmmaking to convey the story. It isn't achieved by following some technical trends which make nice-looking YouTube videos. The producers on modern Star Trek shouldn't feel insecure about Star Trek's production values. They shouldn't need to insist on everything looking cinematic. They just need to use the tools of cinema to tell Star Trek stories. Thank you for watching. As I said at the start of this video, this was originally a Patreon exclusive. I'm currently working on part 3 of my Stargate retrospective, and those big feature-length videos take a while to put together, which means longer gaps between uploads, which the YouTube algorithm really doesn't like. So if you want to help make this channel more self-sufficient, consider jumping over to my Patreon using the link down below. Speaking of which, I'd like to quickly thank all of my patrons and members, with an ultra thanks to Benjamin Stokes, Hiroshi the Dog, Movie Magic, Charles Borsam, Olivia Computer, Bano, Dent the Air, Extreme Streamers, Tom, Dusk, Colin Camille, Patrick Fleming, Matthew Camille, Ed Mark Starr, Dylan Thomas, Lilac Yane, Howard Craig Akarvik, and Caging G. Thank you once again for watching, have a good one, and I'll see you next time.